it certainly doesn't feel to him like the Americans are his allies at the table. They're trying to be mediators, but in some ways, when it comes to the business side of things, they seem to be leaning heavily in Russia's favor.
President Zelensky of Ukraine is exploring the possibility of holding elections in his country despite still being at war with Russia. He said a ceasefire needs to be a precondition of such a poll, but he's trying to get behind President Donald Trump's peace initiative, with talks with Russia and the US scheduled for tomorrow. So a lot on his mind, and someone who knows President Zelensky's mind is Simon Shuster. He's just interviewed the Ukrainian president at the Munich Security Conference. He's an armed conflict and national security writer at The Atlantic, and he joins us now. Good morning.
Good morning. Nice to be with you.
Lovely to have you with us. Can I ask you first, given that you have just been with President Zelensky and you've just interviewed him, what was his mood like?
Very stubborn, very resilient, as he's known to be. Honestly, from talking to some of his aides and advisors leading up to the interview in the days before, I had the sense that there was a lot of concern that this is the window of opportunity to reach a deal while President Trump is paying attention to the war in Ukraine and while President Trump is pulling the Russians to the table. But when I got into the room to talk to President Zelensky, he seemed much more firm in his position than I expected from talking to his aides, in saying, hey, if we don't get a good deal, I'm not going to take a bad deal to my people in Ukraine and offer it to them for a vote in a referendum, because if it's a bad deal, it's not worth taking.
And were you any clearer about the idea of what a bad deal would be? Because often we're told Ukraine will not cede any territory at all, even despite what has been sort of lost to Russia so far. Others say the position is more nuanced. Did you get any clarity on that?
Yeah, the position has become much more nuanced, under the very intense pressure that Ukraine is facing from the Trump administration diplomatically and from the Russians on the battlefield. So the Ukrainians are willing to consider all kinds of configurations that would essentially turn the hottest zone of the front line into some kind of demilitarized zone, a buffer zone, whatever you want to call it, but a place where both the Ukrainian and the Russian troops withdraw to a certain line. And then in between, you have some kind of foreign monitors, peacekeepers. Again, the names vary here. But the Ukrainian negotiators have considered all kinds of formulas like that and have been discussing them with the Russians now, just in the last two rounds of negotiations, and with the Americans certainly. So no, there's flexibility, certainly there's room, but the red lines that President Zelensky draws are, look, if we withdraw, the Russians have to withdraw. We're not going to pull back from our territory and just let the Russians walk in. Basically anywhere at the front. That's one of the red lines.
And how much confidence do you think that President Zelensky has in President Donald Trump at the moment? We know that relationship has been a difficult one. Obviously, it's key to trying to get any kind of peace agreement that works. How do you think things are going?
I mean, it's the only game in town for him. He had to be quite cautious, and I think he was maybe more frank than again in describing the relationship with President Trump than his advisors would have liked. He expressed some concern, for example, of one thing that's been worrying him. So in parallel to the peace negotiations, the Americans and the Russians have been having talks about business deals. And he told me that one of the elements of that conversation between the United States and Russia are possible business deals on the territory of Ukraine that Russia has occupied. And he's like, come on, you can't do that. I mean, at least don't do it behind our backs. So that was very worrying, and it's a sign of just the complexity of the American position. It certainly doesn't feel to him like the Americans are his allies at the table. They're trying to be mediators, but in some ways, when it comes to the business side of things, they seem to be leaning heavily in Russia's favor.
And just finally, Simon, if there were to be a deal struck and a ceasefire were part of that, there is also the suggestion of elections in Ukraine.
Yeah.
How secure would President Zelensky's position be in any of those elections, given that we are still hearing, a number of claims about corruption at the heart of his administration?
Yeah, the corruption scandals have been quite explosive and damaging for his approval ratings. I expect if there is an election called, we'd have a window of about 2 months before the actual vote, when those kinds of issues would be very hotly debated, and his rivals for the presidency, whoever they turn out to be, will throw those in his face. Opinion polls, though, show that he's in a pretty strong position. I think Ukrainians really appreciate just how much he's done to keep the international community, the West, on his side, how much he's done just to keep the nation alive, as a leader in wartime. So I think his chances are good, despite the corruption scandals that have affected members of his team.
And he came across as confident.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of elections, he didn't give a prediction of like if he would win or not.
No politician ever does.
But we were talking more about, how realistic is it to call an election when you have bombs falling on various Ukrainian cities, many Ukrainian cities, including the capital, all the time.
Yeah.
How are people going to vote? How are soldiers going to vote? I mean, this is what's on his mind when you ask him about elections.
Yeah, it's such a difficult question. Simon, thanks for giving us your insight there.
Thank you. Glad to join you.
Thank you. That's Simon Shuster there from The Atlantic, who interviewed President Zelensky at the Munich Security Conference last week.